Shadows on Media. This is Coming Out Stories. It's a podcast about one of the most important conversations of your life. I'm Emma Goswell. Time now to hear from Christine Burns, MBE, and author of Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows. She first came out in 1958 at the tender age of 4.
I have come out so many times. Where do you start? Which one do you start with? The one I start with nowadays, because what I'm doing now is saying that actually when I was born in 1954, I'm 65, was about the time that a lot of stories about trans people started coming into the mainstream. And when I was about 4 and a half maybe, just before I started school, so I can pin it quite well, I remember telling my mum that I wanted to grow up to be a lady.
Wow.
And she was very good. She just sort of brushed it off and made a little bit of fun. And then I got quite upset and I ran off upstairs. And my dad came and saw me later. But it was sort of, they treated it very lightly. And I realised, it was telegraphed to me that this wasn't something you said. But it was there very strongly.
And you said it, you articulated it at the age of 4.
Yeah,
this is probably the earliest coming out I've ever heard of, actually. Coming out at the age of 4. Wow.
But I immediately went back in again because you get these signals from the grown-ups around you and from school as well that there are certain things you don't say.
Well, I guess they sound like they just sort of laughed it off, really.
They did. And I was a child who was easily embarrassed, and I was quite quiet and shy. And so I just took it in and filed it as, mustn't say that.
And of course, this was the 1950s. They wouldn't have had any points of reference, really, not like parents might have today.
1958. As I say, just after I was born, there was a story in the press of a trans woman called Roberta Cowell, and that was quite famous. And had also been somebody called Christine Jorgensen, who was globally famous for her transition. I mean, my parents didn't read the newspapers very much anyway.
No, I guess you came to find out about those women a lot later on yourself.
I did. I mean, actually, if we just spool forward from 4 years old to 12 years old, 1966, my parents have got a pub. I used to have lots of time on my hands, which actually was quite good because it meant that I could dress up if I wanted to without anybody sort of catching me. But I remember my dad used to send me to get the Sunday papers. And as soon as I got to the newsagents, there was a sign outside that said, my life as a girl or my life as a woman. This was the story of April Ashley in the papers. And you immediately spot this. If you are trans, you are sort of tuned to seeing anything like that. So I grabbed the papers, ran home. And again, I can picture the exact scene in the kitchen, kneeling on the carpet. My parents were downstairs serving customers, and I'm reading all about April Ashley. And as you said, we didn't have any points of reference other than maybe seeing female impersonators on the television. I've forgotten Danny LaRue.
Gosh, which is not quite the same thing, is it?
No, that's right.
Not even slightly. Yeah.
But it is where everybody got their points of reference from. If that's all you understand about trans people is a man who cross dresses for entertainment. That's so. Yeah, and in that moment, I discovered that I wasn't the only person like me in the world, because I did actually worry that was uniquely freakish, and that there was a name for people like me, and because I was reading it in the News of the World, that it was a very bad thing to be.
Oh, of course.
So
that's been going on from time immemorial.
Time immemorial, yes. And that's the only way that the press actually reported trans people in those days as well. They'd hit on a formula. Going back to around about 1958, they'd found that they could sell Sunday papers by doing shock horror exposés of trans people in the Sunday tabloids. That was how we were represented.
So she hadn't chosen to speak to them or sell her story? It was sort of just written about her?
Roberta uniquely had actually chosen to sell her story. I think she needed the money. I've been told that what she got for her series in the Picture Post in 1954 was, in today's terms, about £200,000.
Wow!
So she did well out of that.
Okay.
But these were big stories. They weren't the first stories, as it happens, but they were they were the time when suddenly the press noticed that trans people existed.
Okay, so just to rewind on something that you said a moment ago. So between the age of 4, you knew
Yes.
that you wanted to grow up to be a woman.
Yeah.
And at the age of 12, you realised you weren't the only one. But in between those times, you said you were dressing up. Is that what you did?
Yes, because my elder sister, who's 10 years older than me, that had left home many years since, and quite a lot of her clothes were still in dressing tables and wardrobes. So I actually had a complete wardrobe to play with. And I had hours and hours and hours on my own because my parents got a pub when I was about 11 years old, and I had to learn to look after myself. So I'd do my homework, and then the rest of the evening was mine. So I wasn't completely unsupervised, which is a degree of freedom I think most children of that age would never have had.
And did you ever get caught? Did anyone know what you were doing?
No, and I don't think there was any suspicion of I was very careful. Again, I think that probably tells you that I knew that this was something that would bring the ceiling down, bring the sky down on me if anybody knew. And I don't know where we get those intimations from, because I've listened to other people you've interviewed, and it's the same sort of thing, that we all know that what we are apparently is bad.
Well, I think particularly for gay people and the LGB part of our community, they're hearing it in the playground all the time. Even now, kids in the playground go, "Oh, I don't like that chair, it's gay," and they're being told constantly from a young age, gay is bad. But I don't even think that probably at school they were saying anything about trans people, were they? They were almost so invisible.
They quite often called me a girl, and they had a girl's name for me sometimes, because I think children actually, before the adults, were reading me because of my mannerisms, because of the way I talk, because I was quiet and I was bookish.
So you got bullied?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. I can write a book on bullying. And I went through a lot of schools. That was the only thing that saved me to an extent. My parents were moving around a lot because they were buying houses to renovate. We lived in them. And then when they'd renovated the house, they sold it for a profit and then moved on to something bigger. They were working their way up from our working class beginnings. So I was constantly experiencing new schools and having to be sussed out by new groups of children. And I very quickly became the kid that got bullied.
And when they called you female names, did it hurt you, or were you secretly pleased?
It was a bit of a mixed feeling, really. Because I knew it was meant to hurt. So I took it as hurt. And I was trying to deny myself. I mean, if you realise you've got something that makes you, I can't find a polite word for it really, but you're a bit, in the world's terms, a freak. Therefore, you don't want to be that. I wanted to, the first thing I really wanted to do was to grow up and be ordinary.
So I guess it was a very long process then to go from that sort of scared 12-year-old that at least realises there's someone else out there, then you're not the only person in the world that's trans, to then actually articulating it as a teenager or an adult.
Yes, I mean, the next step was when I was 18, I left home. We were in the southeast of England, and I came up to Manchester to go to university. I came here in 1972. And I've been here more or less ever since. So I think I can claim to be a northerner now.
What I love about your story is, though, you just say went to university. You only studied with Alan Turing's colleagues at the School of Computer Science. Yes. It couldn't really get more gay, could it, really?
No, I suppose not. But I didn't realise, looking back, had I realised, I think I would have had a very different existence. I arrived in university in 1972 at the time that the Gay Liberation Front in Manchester was beginning to find its feet. But it was a very straight environment. I remember my very first night in a hall of residence. The chair of the Residents Association of our hall stood up at dinner and gave instructions about the places to avoid, which were essentially the precursors of Canal Street.
Avoid the gays.
Yes.
Yeah. For a lot of people, going to university and being away from the family is a chance to be them true selves. Did you ever feel that was possible at that stage?
Yes, increasingly. I mean, for my first couple of years, I was living in Hull. So you're actually, you're very constrained because people wander in and out all the time. You don't actually have, even though you have a room, you don't have much privacy.
So were you doing anything then to portray the gender you identify with?
Covertly, really. At first, it was because I'd got myself some wheels. I'd got a car, and that meant I could get away into remote places where I could just imagine being me. I mean, it's very amateur. I feel ashamed of how ashamed I was, but there were no role models. The only role models actually were having read about April Ashley in the newspapers, and that wasn't a good thing. And then in 1974, so I was 20 then, there was an autobiography by a Times journalist, Jan Morris, who had spent the better part of 10 years transitioning. And they both ended up going to a surgeon in Casablanca. And I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember this, but in the 1970s, we didn't go abroad. You know, the only way to go abroad was probably to join the armed forces. We didn't have holidays in Mallorca or whatever until the very first package tour company came along.
Different times.
Yeah, so they thought that you would go to somewhere in North Africa. I only knew about Casablanca because of the film, so I always think about the place in black and white.
Yeah, me too. so the whole thing of surgery then probably seemed out of your reach.
That's right. It was something that a different kind of people did.
But you knew about other trans people then. Did you ever make any attempt to contact other trans people?
Yes, and that's another thing that happened in 1974. A group had just been set up in Manchester on Camp Street.
Brilliant.
So I had no difficulty remembering the address. Yeah. But I went there and I sort of staked it out from across the road, saw people coming and going, and my heart's going thump, 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 thump in my chest. And am I going to go in? No, I shan't. Yes, I shall. And eventually I plucked up the courage and knocked on the door. And actually, what do you ask for? Are you the transsexual group or whatever? So
it's because, of course, people were transsexuals rather than transgendered, weren't they, for a long time?
Yes. So I went in, and there was a back room, and I remember it was fairly seedy. There was a settee with springs coming out of the sofa. There were cracked mugs with the tea. It was very much about just people just being relieved to meet somebody like themselves.
Well, it must have been a huge relief, because this must be the first time that you've met another adult and articulated.
That's right, yes, and realised that I could talk to people and actually find some connection.
So that was kind of your first coming out as trans then, really?
Coming out definitely to myself in a way, because to go to that actually meant acknowledging to myself that I wanted to talk to people like myself.
And how old were you at this stage?
20.
So that's 16 years of knowing.
Yeah.
And not being able to do anything about it.
That's right.
That's a long wait.
It is, yeah.
So what happened after that?
Well, I left it a few years because actually being able to go and see that group periodically was a sort of like a safety valve. It was an opportunity. It was going round and round in my head. You know, when you've got an earworm and you can't get it out. Well, it's the same sort of thing. And I'd say, yeah, I'm going to go there this Wednesday and talk to people.
Was it a big group? Were there many people?
Initially, it wasn't, but it grew. So I remember towards the beginning of the 80s, I think there used to be about 30 people there.
Wow. And this isn't relevant to your story, but I'm just interested, and other people might be. How many were people that were born male but that identified as female, and how many were actually the other way around?
You've got to distinguish between people who went to that group and what the community might be. Because just as I tended to think, I'm not sure whether this group is for me, because the group was dominated by people who just cross-dressed once a week, and it was their relaxation. And they sat around and they would talk about steam engines and computers.
Which is a different thing, being a cross-dresser to being transgendered.
But as I've written in my book, Trans Britain, transsexual people was such a small community that beggars can't be choosers. We didn't have our own groups.
But it must have been nice to even have that safe space where you could dress as a woman and be a woman.
That's right, yes. Yeah.
That must have been quite a revelation for you, really.
It was, and it actually sort of hammered home to me, because one of the things you might think to yourself is, well, maybe I could just be a cross-dresser and I could contain it to the occasional evening and then put it away in a box. And that will be enough. And that won't mean the potential of losing my friends, losing my job, losing everything.
And that's really what you thought you were facing?
Which was the prospect, yes. Otherwise, I was as a research student in Manchester in the mid-70s. I was enjoying myself. I was producing a radio show for Radio Manchester. I was doing my research. I liked the people I worked with. But I didn't think anybody would accept me if I actually said, I'm going to transition to be a woman.
So what changed? Because at some point you obviously did.
Well, in 1976, I came very close to the first attempt to transition permanently. I actually found a doctor, and quite scarily, the doctor just said, yeah, we think you're transsexual and there's somebody I can refer you to. Come back next week and tell me if you want me to do that. And that was so scary that I actually gave up my PhD study and ran away, effectively.
Oh, because someone had given you the opportunity that you'd always wanted.
Because it meant facing up to all the prospects, and I was pretty sure of what the prospects would be. That that I wouldn't be able to continue being a research student or go on to be a lecturer. I wouldn't be allowed near a microphone on the BBC again, on all those things. And so, in a way, actually, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because I ran away from all of them anyway.
Well, could you not have finished your PhD and then transitioned, or you didn't? You were so excited and eager to do it.
It was so It was just having once you've sort of acknowledged to yourself that much that this is what you are, then you can't put it back in the box.
No, there's no going back.
And the only going away was an act of desperation, saying to myself, "I'll get a job in industry." And I'll make another start, and we'll have no more of this.
You ran away. Where did you go?
I got a job with a computer company called International Computers, and I went to join them as writing courses and books down in Windsor. I didn't actually stay there for very long because I was very lonely there, even though I was surrounded by colleagues. And so I ended up managing to engineer within the same company to come back to Manchester so I could be near the people I'd left.
So at what point did you admit it to yourself and then actually tell other people that this is what you were going to do?
Well, the next stage was I got so desperate that I actually told my parents. Again, I was trying to sort of cut off my lines of escape from myself. So I got very drunk one night, and about 3 o'clock in the morning I rang my parents. And I was, again, for some reason, I always seem to do this stuff kneeling on the carpet with the phone in front of me. And my father answered the phone, and I said, "Dad, I've got to tell you, I want to be a girl. I want to be a woman." And I think I laugh now, looking back. He said, "You better speak to your mother."
Is that all he said?
Yes. So she came on the phone, and what she said to me has always stuck with me. She said, "Darling," she said, "we made you, and whatever you are, we'll love you." And
it's wonderful.
It is. And I'd actually become quite distanced from my parents. I don't know whether that was because I was angry with them for perceiving that they would be a barrier. That because I thought if I come out, because that moment on that phone call, I thought I'm about to lose my parents. I might not ever see them again, because that happens so often to people. But so that's a mark of my desperation, that I actually felt it had come to the point that I was actually prepared to lose my parents.
How old were you at this stage then?
I'm just trying to think that one through. I think that was around about 1982. So I was just under 30.
Gosh, so you had waited a long time then, hadn't you?
Because I'm very good at sort of trying to distract myself. I worked very hard. I had these mitigating ways of trying to pretend it was just something I could handle.
And did they accept it then, do you think?
They did, actually, because I went down to see them. They lived in Kent still, and they met me, Christine. And I remember we spent the evening sitting, having drinks and chatting and talking about everything. And my mum just immediately sort of just clicked into, this is my daughter. They were incredibly good at that, and I'd completely misread them.
So they never misgendered you after that? Then?
No, because I just assumed from the things that you pick up from listening to what they say when they see something on the television or what they read in the papers, that they would, disapprove, and because they had been disapproving about other things, not about me, but they certainly disapproved of things that my older sister had done. So I just expected that was going to be the mark. I don't know whether from that experience with my sister, they sort of learned and thought, we should just loosen up a bit here.
Yeah, they sound very respectful. I mean, even today, a lot of parents do struggle and misgender their children, don't they?
They do.
Yeah.
I think they had to work hard to try and get themselves some information. My mum was proud of the number of local police that she could cultivate as friends. So she went to see a local sergeant, and she told him, and he explained it all to her. And I think her getting it from an official she looked up to.
Really?
Yes,
okay.
Police sergeant. She thought, okay, that's okay. This has a name. This is a condition,
and this sergeant knew all about it then, somehow.
So
wow.
Just as well, if he'd said, for God's sake, hold them there until I get round with the handcuffs, it might have been different.
God. So did you ever come out at work then? Eventually, obviously.
I started planning for that then. Again, I thought the chances were that my colleagues wouldn't know what to do with me. So I changed my work to being self-employed. I set up an IT consultancy of my own on the basis that I couldn't sack myself.
Clever.
And I set about making myself so essential to my clients, they would have to think twice or three times about just letting me go. So actually, when I did finally take the final step of saying, okay, this is, on this particular day, that I'm going to be Christine forever, that they had actually had a company meeting, one of the clients, and the managing director told the staff, look, this is happening to this person, and we are going to accept her. And if anybody has any trouble with that, you come and see me.
Wow.
So I have been incredibly fortunate over the years that all the terrible things I knew could happen didn't happen, and in fact, quite the reverse. I've been terribly privileged in having been associated with people who have acted like the grown-ups.
It's very interesting, isn't it? It's so different to coming out as LG or B in that, you really planned for it, didn't you?
Yeah.
You knew that there was one day where your old name, your old gender had gone, and you were going to present as Christine, and that was it. And you planned for that for years.
Well, it's the thing is, you cannot avoid coming out when you're trans, because unless you move overnight, then people are going to know that something's changed. I think you can succeed in being gay or lesbian for a very long time without telling your colleagues. And well, in fact, I know that
because they're not going to know what necessarily,
right.
are they?
In companies that I dealt with, as soon as they knew, Christine's trans, I would have the gays and the lesbians in that company coming and buttonholing me and making me their friend, and they weren't out. But so in a sense, they were observing me with real interest to see how their colleagues behaved towards me.
So it's interesting that you're keen to still be out, because I know certainly for a lot of trans people it is just all about passing, and they don't want to acknowledge their past gender, and they don't necessarily want to talk about it. But why do you see it as an important thing to talk about?
I tried that. I mean, I was very fortunate in that very quickly I was able to pass and go invisible. And in a line of work where I was constantly meeting new clients, in a way it was simpler, and it was simpler for my big clients who were sometimes recommending me to just let's all just accept Christine as Christine, and please don't bring it up because that'll make awkward conversations for us. So there was a lot of encouragement, and then I was living in a very conservative part of Cheshire as well, so in a way I felt it was safest to be in what we call stealth. And then a number of things started to happen where I realised that if somebody isn't standing up and doing something, then it's never going to get any different. One of the characteristics of trans history is that all the way from the setting up of the very first support group in 1966, all the way through to the end of the 80s, so that's about 25 years, nothing had progressed other than people having support groups where you could go and meet people and you could talk and you could exchange anecdotes about how somebody had petrol through their letterbox.
So nothing had progressed in terms of rights and society being complete bastards to people.
It looked like something, how can we change this? Because there didn't seem to be any means. Normally, if there's a social wrong, then you might go to the press and somebody would take up your cause. Well, the press wasn't interested in that. They've got a way of writing about us, and it was the freaks on Sunday. You could go to an MP, but this was the time of Section 28. There were no votes for MPs in getting involved with trans people. So how would you begin when everything is against you? How would you begin to change that?
So in your mind, it's important to be visible so that at least people know about you and can talk about you.
What changed it was reading the reports of 2 trans people who'd actually found something they could do. And both of them had ended up going to the European Court of Human Rights to argue for the fact that they had no privacy, because whenever somebody wanted to see your birth certificate, that would immediately out you. In those days, you couldn't marry in a way that wouldn't stand out a mile. The government at the time, it was saying that gay relationships were pretended and not valid, was saying to people like me that I could marry a woman.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it?
I could have a same-sex marriage because, as far as they were concerned, administratively, that was a heterosexual marriage. It was mad. So these 2 went to court on the same basis. One is the right to private life, and the other was their right to marry, because both wanted to marry in terms of their acquired gender, what they changed to, heterosexually. So Mark Rees, a lovely man, if he was going to marry at all, he wanted to marry a woman. Caroline Cossey, a beautiful model and TV hostess, if she wanted to marry, well, in fact, she was engaged to marry a man.
And at the time, the government said, no, you can't, because it's not allowed.
So they had reasons, valid reasons, to go all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights. The press reported it. And although both of them lost, they started a conversation and got people who were interested in civil liberties interested. People like Sir Alex Carlile, who was, at those days was the Liberal Democrats' Home Affairs spokesman. And he, in fact, asked to meet Mark and any friends of his, and they went to meet him in Parliament, and he encouraged them to set up an activist campaign. So that was the point in time in 1992 where suddenly trans people had an activist campaign. There was something we could do, was something we could work on, and we had a lever. We could use the law, because unlike everybody else, the law doesn't do fake news, it doesn't do hysteria, it's interested in the facts. And the facts in our case were very much on our side. It was a terrible injustice. So we could keep going back to the courts with different examples of people being discriminated or put out of work, and they would listen. And if they found in our favour at the right level, which they did, then government had to do something. So in 1996, the European Court of Justice ruled that it was sex discrimination to dismiss somebody because they were undergoing or had undergone gender reassignment. That meant that the new Labour government in 1997 had to do something about it. And as a result of that, we got the first legislation to protect trans rights.
So it was really important for you to get involved in the movement.
That's right. I got involved in 1993. So, I was really at the heart of that and seeing, how we move this forward and how we exploit it.
Gosh, you've come a long way then, considering you've got an MBE.
Yeah. Sometimes I look at that at the top of the stairs and I think, oh, yeah, OK, I'm official.
Yeah. And that's for your campaigning work?
It was. It was awarded because my colleagues and I then got very closely involved with civil servants and ministers to help craft the gender recognition bill for a couple of years at the beginning of the noughties. And our job really was to make sure that the government could get it through Parliament without getting a scratch on them. And so I think a grateful government and a grateful Queen decided we should have this award. And my colleague Stephen Whittle, he had an OBE as well.
Fabulous.
So, and we accepted those because we felt, because your instinct is to say, well, this has got empire in it and it's got all sorts of bad connotations. But I remember when Angela Mason, one of the first chief executives of Stonewall, was awarded, it was an OBE in her day, in around about 1999. And I remember that it was all over the BBC for a whole day and all over the press. And I thought, yeah, actually, this is a mark that what she did was worth doing. It was important.
It mattered, and it got people talking about the issues again.
That's right. And so, in Stephen and I deciding to accept our honours, it wasn't really for our egos. It was to say, okay, well, if we accept these, we are actually acknowledging and people are actually able to see that people who devoted their spare time to the rights of this tiny group of people, that was something that was worth doing and was worth honouring.
Wow. So we have come a long way there, haven't we? But I think it's fair to say there's still a long way to go for trans rights in this country. Where do you think the campaign should be focused on? Where do you think... What should change for trans people? After
the Gender Recognition Act, we did actually sort of step back and say, well, we were totally focused on that. What on earth do we do now? And it took us a while to work out, and we sort of made a little list, and we said, well, there's still some legislation to sort out because it was incomplete. We were still vulnerable in places. So that's one thing. The way that the press reports trans people and the media features trans people, that's a big important issue. And the other one was the elephant in the room, which was that all our interactions with the NHS and with doctors in general were a complete disaster area. So we needed to work on that as well. So for the first few years after the Gender Recognition Act, we sort of pushed on with those things. And then I think we reached the end of our personal tether. I had already burned out once, and I was feeling like I was going to burn out again. We started to fall out with each other. And I felt by about 2007/8 that it was time to let young people have a go. Because by then we were in our 50s, we'd tired ourselves out. And actually, we also, we want to have lives. So I actually made it known that I wanted to step down and retire, and that I wanted a new generation to come along. Because for one thing, even though I've grown so much over the years, getting awards does help with your self-esteem, I'm still that kid who grew up in a world that thought that what I was dirty and sort of icky. And I think that affects how you approach, how vigorously you can demand full equality. Whereas young people, they've grown up with the rights that we'd won for them. They don't have any of that baggage. They actually see that, I deserve this stuff. Young people are far more in your face.
They are, aren't they? The young people are amazing in 2019.
I'm still so frigging polite.
Which brings me nicely on to my last sort of question, really. I'm sure, all these rights have been won and it is brilliant, but obviously it's still difficult to accept your gender sometimes, and people are growing up in difficult families and difficult situations. What word of advice would you give to a young person struggling and trying to come to terms with their gender identity and not feeling able to speak out?
Oh, goodness. Well, I guess I could say, look at my own life. It didn't have the best of beginnings, but look where I've ended up. That you can be the person that you're destined to be. But don't feel that it all has to happen straight away. Take your time. And I know that's a very difficult thing to say to a young person, but actually spending the time like I did to actually organise my employment so that I wasn't going to become destitute. To plan, okay, I'm going to do this. What are the steps I need? Treat it as a project. And along the way, of course, learn about your own history.
Hang on, is this going to be a mention of your book?
Well,
you might as well.
I was trying to be so
I was going to bring it in anyway, Christine, don't worry. I'm a true professional.
Other books are available, but certainly start with this one, Trans Britain. Before creating it, there had never been a book that could just in one place tell a trans person or their family or their allies, what we've been through. That story I've just told you. And I think it's an inspiring story because it's full of so many really good role models of people who've grown up at each stage of that. And I think if you've read that, then I think you'll know how to manage your own transition and this really exciting journey. Because I think the message of hope would be that you might think of being trans as being a bit of a bummer. It's a bad hand to be dealt, but actually it isn't, because we all get to do something that the vast majority of human beings never get to do. Most human beings get issued a gender when they're born, and they're supposed to stick with that. So they grow up, they live their entire life experiencing only half of what it is to be a human being. Now, I didn't much enjoy experiencing the other half, although it's great to have spent some time in the boys' showers, because I learned a lot from that. But and I had the perfect disguise. I think I understand gender on a level that I guess other people may not do, because of that experience of seeing it from both sides. And there's so many layers to that. We could do an entire other podcast to it. But as a result, and because of the person it's made me, struggling through hard times, finding resources, finding and being surprised by what I could do, I would never trade it. People might say, wouldn't you perhaps wish that you'd just been born a girl and grown up and done the usual stuff? Well, yeah, that's one way of living a life. I won't decry it, because that's what half of the population gets to do. But I've actually thought I'd been handed a really bad hand, but actually it's turned out to be such an exciting journey of discovery. I'm a better person than I could ever have been had I not been challenged in this way.
That's such a beautifully optimistic and positive way to end. So thank you so much for talking to Coming Out Stories, Christine Burns, MBE.
Thank you. And get the book.
And author of
Trans Britain.
Trans Britain. There you go. Big thank you to Christine for sharing her coming out story, and also quite a lot of trans history. Don't forget, you can find out more in her book, Trans Britain, Our Journey from the Shadows. Please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. We'd also love to hear from you on Twitter. You can find us there at Come Out Stories. I'm Emma Goswell, and Coming Out Stories is a What Goes On media production. Next time you'll meet GJ. Her parents are from Barbuda near Antigua, and she really struggled with being a lesbian because of her Rastafarian faith. She was actually outed while she was living in Leicester by the Caribbean Times.
I wasn't so much annoyed, I was more worried because, like I said, I wasn't out. I was still coming to terms with my sexuality. I knew that my parents read the Caribbean Times, so I did actually phone them and said, oh, guess what, I'm in the newspaper. And they're like, oh, they thought it was about my poetry. And then I'm like, but I happened to be walking in front of a black lesbian and gay banner, and I remember my mum saying to me, are you gay? And I remember saying no, because I wasn't ready.